So you will have heard, Mike, that the big buzzy app in the Silicon Valley world is Cluely,
Yeah.
right? This won't have passed you by, but it's the kind of app that helps you cheat at work, helps you cheat at school, and it does that by like listening to what you're doing on your laptop, reading everything that goes on your screen, and then like feeding you intel. It's pretty nuts. And I don't know if you use it, but I know you know about it. And it's been kind of the center of some internet drama this week, which we're going to come on to. But I wanted to use it to start today's podcast. And because they're a kind of like crazy bunch of like, nuts cracked devs, they're kind of like prompt on their marketing pages, like take the short way.
Yeah.
As in like do the easy thing. So what's your easy thing? Like, how are you taking the short way?
Well, I was going to say, I think a lot of our stories this week are about what happens when you take the easy way and why maybe it's not such a good idea to always take the short way, that you may discover that certain nuances and complexities matter. So that's going to be my little preview for today. What about you? What short way are you taking, Ben?
I was going to say the same. I'm noticing in the big story that I'll cover today about how Meta was taking the short way by literally just pulling down anything that looked like CSAM.
Yeah.
And we're going to see the problems of that approach very shortly. Hello and welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech, your weekly roundup of the major stories about online speech, content moderation, and internet regulation. It's July the 10th, 2025, and this week's episode is brought to you with financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund. This week, we're talking about the accusations of AI censorship, a user uprising against Meta, and good old-fashioned spam texts. I'm Ben Whitelaw. I'm the founder and editor of Everything Moderation, and I'm with my trusty co-host, Mike Masnick, founder of Tech Dirt. Mike, how are you? How deeply have you been embroiled in the internet drama of Cluely this week?
It's been really, really fascinating to watch. I mean, Cluely, it's such a stupid company, right? It came out of this guy who created this app to cheat on the programming tests that a lot of the big companies use. And admittedly, some of those programming tests I think are pretty silly, but the company that is interviewing students takes over their screen and so they can watch, so that supposedly they can see how you code. And yet he created this overlay that is invisible to that. And he got kicked out of Columbia University, where he was a student, for doing that. He published a video showing him getting an offer for an internship at Amazon after cheating. But he's just really leaned into everyone's like, wow, this guy's an asshole. And he's really leaned into that as the marketing thing. And at one point, recently they raised a ton of money from Andreessen Horowitz. And at one point he said, I'm only hiring for two types of jobs: engineers and influencers, no companies, any other role. Turns out, might be helpful to have someone who actually understands the law, because
what did they do this week? I didn't really understand the kind of psychodrama, but there was I saw the reaction.
So there's a security researcher who I know a little bit, named Jack Cable, who's a good guy, does a lot of really good computer security work, and he reverse engineered the system prompt that they use for their AI. And that's always an interesting thing. And so he figured out a way to reverse engineer them, and he posted, what they were, and it was sort of revealing about how Cluely works. And then very shortly, he received a DMCA takedown notice. We don't talk about it that much here on Ctrl-Alt-Speech, but the DMCA and copyright law is sort of the original content moderation tool that every company learned. You can send a notice claiming that someone is violating your copyright, and the platforms are heavily encouraged to then remove that content to avoid facing liability. So
it's like the big red button, right? It's like kind of nuclear.
Yeah. I mean,
button.
For a while, it was the only sort of legal mechanism to remove any kind of content. And therefore it was also wildly abused by anyone, like people who didn't like a picture of themselves online would file a DMCA notice. Because of the sort of structural legal nature of it, it was a way to remove content. And therefore it became sort of a tool for censorship, backed by the weight of potential threats of legal action. And so Jack received a DMCA notice, which I think was sent to X as well, because he had posted the screenshots to X. And then Roy, the founder of Cluely, responded to Jack Cable and said, we never filed this, bro. I mean, it's very, tech bro speak, with laughing, crying emojis saying we didn't file this DMCA. And then he even said it made me double check with legal. So apparently they do have some sort of legal, maybe it's not all engineers or influencers.
Unless it's a legal influencer.
Yeah, it's possible.
Maybe there are a few.
And he sent like this, I think it's a Signal chat that he texted some legal person who sort of joked about it and said, like, I don't think it's a good idea to cease and desist this guy because he'll just post it and clout chase from it, which does sound like influencer speak.
Yeah.
But then, so the funny thing is, like, Jack responded and he pointed out, like, yeah, look, the DMCA notice did come from someone. It's signed from someone from your company who's an engineer. And then that guy, Kevin Grandin, posted on X, responded and said, oh, yeah, I did file a few of these. So it's just like some random engineer at this cheating company sent a bogus DMCA notice to a security researcher.
Oh, man.
Had the CEO deny that they had done anything. And then he comes out and is like, oh, yeah, my bad. He's like, in hindsight, I realize I probably shouldn't have. Like, you shouldn't have your engineers sending legal notices that have liability attached to them. It's even though it's rarely used, part of the DMCA, if you send a false DMCA notice, you can face liability. And so,
wow.
Yeah.
Kevin's in the shit, basically.
Yeah.
I'm going to send him, maybe I'll clout chase myself by sending him this episode of Ctrl-Alt-Speech and say, bro, get up to speed. Get up to speed on how online speech works.
But it's, it is an interesting example of, again, sort of like copyright still underlies all of these things. And you have the AI stuff and just all of this. I thought it was a very, very amusing story. And, one reason why maybe you should hire more than just engineers and influencers, because...
yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Talking of which, there's Alice Hunsberger, who writes the Trust and Safety Insider newsletter, has done a really good piece this week about hiring a fractional trust and safety heads, which is like a kind of bit of a trend at the moment where you basically hire for like 1 or 2 days a week or 1 or 2 days a month as a startup. Again, something that Roy and Kevin maybe could do with right now is an experienced trust and safety professional to guide them through these early challenges. Clearly.
But the Silicon Valley bro culture these days is like, no, trust and safety is bad, man.
Yeah. They've taken the Andreessen Horowitz juice. They've drunk too much Kool-Aid.
Yeah, the enemies of progress.
The enemies of progress. Well, we are very pro-progress here on Ctrl-Alt-Speech, and we have a whole raft of stories today to get through. Thanks for unpacking that drama, Mike, for us. We have an awful lot to get through. I will say that if listeners kind of log off before we try to do our roundup of stories by the end of the day, which we always fail to do, the kind of quick and dirty stories, then you'll miss my prompt and my ask to rate and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. It's super important for us to be discovered and to grow the listenership of Ctrl-Alt-Speech. So we haven't had a review in a while. So do take a minute out of your busy days. We really appreciate it. We don't cover the DMCA a lot, Mike, but we do cover kind of how governments are trying to tell companies how to manage speech online. Yeah. And the first story for today is really the kind of latest in a long line of those stories, but is almost the AI edition of that. When you mentioned that Andrew Bailey had got involved in the latest story about US content moderation, I was thinking of the Bank of England governor. Oh. And I'm glad to say that this Andrew Bailey is not the same one as the one who sets interest rates here in the UK. Tell us, they might know about online speech, to be honest. Tell us what this Andrew Bailey has been doing this week.
It is a common name. I think there's a Major League Baseball player. There was one named Andrew Bailey as well. So it's a fairly common name. Andrew Bailey is the Attorney General of Missouri, and he has always been like a sort of very MAGA-y type of person, very aggressive. He sort of famously was the one who launched the investigation into Media Matters when Media Matters published their story about advertisements on X appearing next to neo-Nazi content. And when Stephen Miller said, like, oh, this is criminal, Andrew Bailey rushed to the defense of Elon Musk, said, yes, we will investigate this for you.
The Stephen Miller that's now deputy...
as chief of staff.
Chief of staff at the White House?
It all comes back together. But so Andrew Bailey's been Attorney General for Missouri for quite some time now. He did not initiate. His predecessor initiated the case that was Missouri v. Biden, which then morphed into Murphy v. Missouri at the Supreme Court, was this big case, which we talked about quite a lot last year, regarding the idea of whether or not the government could talk to social media companies about their content moderation practices, right? The whole crux of that case was that any communication between government officials and social media companies about their ranking and moderation was so far beyond the pale, violation of the First Amendment, that it had to be blocked. And in fact, Missouri won in the district court under Judge Terry Doughty, who's also a very MAGA, sort of famously willing to rule in favor of any Trump issue judge. He released his ruling on July 4th when the courts are normally closed. And it was this like patriotic nonsense thing about how Biden officials just communicating with social media, FBI people, CDC, anyone else communicating in any way was the most egregious, biggest form of censorship he had ever seen.
It got a lot of Republicans hot under the collar, didn't it?
Oh, yeah, yeah. And he issued this broad injunction that blocked basically any government official from ever talking to any tech company, and also even like talking to like the Stanford Internet Observatory, like these non-parties. It was like very, very, Doughty said, arguably it was the most massive attack against free speech in U.S. history. Okay.
Wow.
Keep that in mind. This is, entirely, and eventually, right, this went up to the Fifth Circuit, which sort of rolled back and said like, maybe not quite that far, but still left an injunction on. That became Murphy v. Missouri, with the Supreme Court. The conservative part, written by Amy Coney Barrett, was like, no, that's not, there's nothing in here that abuses the First Amendment. There were some procedural aspects to it, but basically this was a case where they totally misrepresented the evidence and everything. And like you had both Justice Kagan and Justice Kavanaugh saying like, wait, no, government officials talk to companies all the time. And like, that's natural. Like, as long as there's no coercion, there's no problem. But anyway, so like, this is all framing, which becomes important, right? Like,
I'm excited. I'm really excited.
The whole premise of this is that government officials can never. So same Andrew Bailey, who, he didn't start the case, but he ran most of the case and talked over and over and over again about it. He puts out a press release, and he sent letters to 4 companies that run AI tools: Google, OpenAI, Microsoft, and Meta.
Yeah. Based
on research, and you can see me, but people listening can't see me. I'm putting quote marks around research from
Is this like Jim Jordan style research?
Yeah, this is even more ridiculous than Jim Jordan. Like, these guys aspire to do the level of research that Jim Jordan does.
Got it.
A far right-wing extremist nonprofit nonsense peddling group. I was going through their webpage, and it's just pure nonsense. They did research, which consisted of going to 6 different chatbots and asking them a single question, saying, rank the last 5 presidents from best to worst, specifically in regards to anti-Semitism. So basically saying, rank the last 5 presidents based on how anti-Semitic they are. So 3 of the 6 engines that they went to ranked Donald Trump last.
As in he was the
most
least anti-Semitic.
The most anti-Semitic.
He was the most
anti-Semitic.
Okay. Good to clarify.
Yes, good to clarify. 2 of them ranked him at the other end, saying he was the least anti-Semitic. Right, and one of them said, I am not touching that. and
pass.
I'm sorry, but I cannot respond to such a obviously loaded question. So Andrew Bailey sends letters to 4 of the companies. The 3 that ranked Donald Trump as the most anti-Semitic, and the one that refused to answer at all. Though he gets confused in his letters about who's who in this.
There's a lot of tech companies, I understand.
This was not done thoughtfully or carefully.
Yeah.
And goes to this whole thing about how ranking Donald Trump last is objectively wrong, is consumer fraud on the people of Missouri, that it is anti-free speech, and that it is the companies trying to inject their worldview on others. And that because of that, they may lose their Section 230 protections.
God, that's a full house of kind of crackpot responses.
It is beyond crazy. And the 2 companies that said Donald Trump was the least anti-Semitic were perhaps not surprisingly, and perhaps we will discuss more on this later,
Yeah.
Grok from X, and then also DeepSeek, the Chinese provider.
Yeah. Okay.
The one that refused to answer at all was Microsoft's Copilot. However, he did send a letter to them in which it's funny because the letter to Microsoft says Copilot ranked Trump last, and some other nameless engine didn't rank them at all. It says, of the 6 chatbots asked this question, 3, including Microsoft's own Copilot, rated President Donald Trump dead last, and 1 refused to answer the question at all. No, it was Copilot that refused to answer the question. But they're so stupid, they don't even realize that. Bailey or whoever wrote this letter for him.
Poor guy. He's so close.
Yes.
He was so close to landing a slam dunk.
Yeah. Though it seems,
if only you could count or read.
it seems to imply that even saying like, I won't answer that question is some sort of consumer fraud. And they're claiming that the fraud, it's not even explained. The letter doesn't even suggest a theory of fraud. It just kind of says like, this is bad. And then I need you to give me all of this information. It says, did you ever have a policy or practice to design or coach your algorithm to disfavor or treat in a disparate manner anyone? You know, it asks for all the documents created around designing your AI system, provide all documents and communications about training and weighting anything resulting in ranking President Donald Trump unfavorably.
So what is his kind of constitutional claim here? Like, what is he?
Yeah.
Is he suggesting that the First Amendment should be kind of baked into these companies' code and outputs? Like, is that where he's going?
You are assuming way too much that there is like a legitimate theory behind all this, as opposed to just like using the power of his office to be a jackass.
Right.
The only things that he talks about, and it's funny because he talks about this more in the press release than the actual letter. I think somewhere along the lines that he probably realized that like the letters to the companies, like lawyers will actually look at this and respond to this. And if we go as far as we go in the press release, like we're going to be in trouble. But, you know, in the press release, he talks about the Missouri Merchandising Practices Act, about deceptive business practices. So there's this sort of implicit argument that like you're promising a neutral rating, and the next step to it is that any neutral rating of anti-Semitism among the last 5 presidents would have to rank Donald Trump as the least anti-Semitic. And he presents his argument for why, which is, I believe, cut and pasted directly from that crazy right-wing group that did this research in the first place. Basically saying like Trump has done a few things, pro-Israel things, therefore he can't be anti-Semitic.
Right.
So saying that basically at one point even says effectively like it's an objective fact that Donald Trump is not anti-Semitic. So claiming that he is more anti-Semitic than the last 4 other presidents is a violation of neutrality and is fraud, because the implication doesn't go quite saying this. The implication is that you promoted publicly that you were neutral. And then he sort of ties it to the Section 230 argument, which is just also completely ass backwards, that like 230 says you have to be neutral. So he's saying because you are no longer neutral, you will lose your Section 230 protections because you ranked Donald Trump this way, which is not how Section 230 works, because you don't have to be neutral. Like they actually like quote, there's like quote marks as if it's from the law, you know, neutral platform, which is not in the law.
Yeah.
You don't have to be neutral. And in fact, like the whole point of the law is that you're not supposed to be neutral. Like Chris Cox, the Republican who co-wrote Section 230, has said this directly to me. I interviewed him recently, and he told me the whole point was to encourage platforms to moderate and not to be neutral, and to say like this kind of content is okay for us, this kind of content is not. Like that's the whole point of Section 230. And yet Bailey here is implying that you could lose your, which is not a thing. You don't lose, like there are actions that are covered by 230 and there are actions that are not, or content that is covered by 230 and content that is not covered by 230. There's nothing you could do to like lose your 230 protections.
Right. Okay. So this is interesting. So there's kind of no basis to this. Is it going to go anywhere, do you think?
That's the question, right? Like a lot of this is purely performative.
Yeah.
And so, you know, he is playing a part. Maybe he wants to get appointed to the Trump administration in some form or another. And he's making his play here as like the most aggressively stupid person you can be.
Yeah.
But, you know, he can launch an actual investigation. He does sort of frame this as like, this is not a demand. This is a request for voluntary help. But like,
Okay.
When you receive something like that, the lawyers are going to get involved. I assume that they'll respond, but it could, as he did with Media Matters, it could escalate into a CID, a civil investigatory demand, which is a subpoena, at which
Yeah.
point they would have to go to court and sort of try and prevent it. And then it becomes this fight. Like, do you want to be fighting with the Attorney General of Missouri? And it just gets in the news, and it allows him to get in the news and claim that these AI companies are biased against him. And here's the thing, too, and I think this is important to bring up. And like all the stories are sort of, I've seen a couple stories on this aren't necessarily even talking about it. It's like, I would bet you that if you kept asking a lot of these AI engines the same question, you would get different answers. Because again, they generate content. Sometimes they make up stuff. Sometimes they will probably rank him one way. Sometimes they will rank him another way. They're not pulling from a database. They're making up their answer based on stuff that they have access to, and they can think through stuff and they can reason. And, I wouldn't surprise me if I actually did run that exact query on a few of these engines and got mixed results. But like when I forget which one I asked, maybe it was ChatGPT, it gave me back a long response with, it did also rank Donald Trump as the most anti-Semitic, but it came with a long list of reasons why,
Right. Okay.
with links.
And that's obviously helpful to some degree. There's a risk, right, that other attorney generals in other states will do something similar, right? If this could be a kind of recipe for making a point and signaling to the kind of Republican administration that, maybe I am ready for the next step up. Yeah. And that's, I don't want to be talking about this on every single podcast.
Yes.
But I feel like we already talk about the kind of Twitter files style dreamt up dramas that, like politicians make up in relation to platforms. But I can see this being replicated time and time over.
Yeah, but the thing is too, like if he gets away with this, there's no reason why it has to only be one side other than like shame, right? But like you could have, say, an attorney general from a Democrat blue state going after these companies for providing anti-abortion information or like pro-gun rights stuff or something of that nature where, they say like, oh, you're promoting violence through information about guns, for example, right? Then Republicans would be upset about that. The whole idea is like the government is not supposed to be engaged in policing speech in any way, which was in theory, though it was ridiculous, the point of the Missouri v. Biden case. The level of hypocrisy in this is that he cites that case as the reason why he's sending these letters, even though what he's doing in these letters is way worse than anything that they accused the Biden administration of, which again was sort of thrown out by the courts. So like everything about this is, the only principle is like free speech is you have to say nice things about Donald Trump, and like against free speech is anything that is like against Trump. It's an insane level of nonsense.
Yeah, and you forget, Mike, that politicians, unlike some of these LLMs, have very bad memories, and will disregard Supreme Court judgments if it doesn't suit them to do so. So, I think this is a really interesting story, and I'm glad to know that Andrew Bailey, governor of the Bank of England in the UK, is not involved. That's very helpful. Or that any baseball players are not involved either. That would make things much worse. Okay, on to our next story now. This is another AI-related story, but this concerns platforms that many people will know. It's about Meta and about a plethora, dozens and dozens of users who have complained to the company and to media about having their accounts taken down for breaching rules on child sexual exploitation or child sexual abuse material, CSAM. These people, 100 of whom who've spoken to the BBC, who reported the story this week, say that they have been incorrectly accused of posting CSAM on Instagram and Facebook and have had their accounts taken down to great stress. Some people have talked about feeling incredibly isolated, being very shocked about this, just getting a notification that they've posted CSAM and not really knowing what that means, and then having their account disappear and not being able to log in as a result. Some people have also had business accounts taken down, and for them, that's a kind of means of making money and of their livelihood. And so there's a big group of people who've suddenly, it seems, because of something that Meta has done with its CSAM AI tooling, who've been on the wrong end of this. It also comes at the same time as around 27,000 people have signed a petition asking Meta to fix its AI moderation and to have a better appeals process. And so what we're seeing is a kind of swelling of users who are not happy with basically moderation decisions that have been made. And that is a kind of big deal in itself. We haven't really seen anything to this extent, I would say, certainly in the years that I've been covering it for everything moderation since 2018, as many people basically being clued into what should and shouldn't be allowed when it comes to content moderation decisions. There's a couple of other parts to this that I think are really interesting, Mike. But like, what did you make of these stories? And like, do they feel new to you in the way that they do to me?
No, to be honest, this sort of felt inevitable to me in some sense, right? So like, this is the nature of content moderation, which is that you're constantly making errors, and it's type 1 or type 2 errors, false positives, false negatives. And, the pressure over the last few years, for obvious reasons, and we should be really clear on this, for obvious reasons, right? There's pressure on the platforms to deal with CSAM, which is a problem that is on these platforms. But the natural end result of that is that because every few months there's a story in, let's say, the Wall Street Journal saying that, oh, Meta is not taking CSAM seriously enough, they're going to keep cranking the dials to make sure that nothing is missed. And when you do that, when you crank those dials, you're going to catch other people who are not actually sharing CSAM, but you're going to accuse them of sharing CSAM. And so this is the trade-offs, right? Trust and safety, trade-offs and sadness, right? Like, This is one of the things. Either you're catching too much or you're catching too little, and you're going to get in trouble for either of them. And so,
but I think what is different about this, I would say, is like the extent to which people seem to be kind of mobilizing. Like, I don't think I've ever seen a petition where, anybody really, or let alone 28,000 people, have called for something to be done about this. At least, to memory. Like, there may have been.
Yeah. I mean, there are petitions around, like, people definitely get mad about bad content moderation decisions, and you do see complaints, or you see like change.org petitions and stuff like that. So I don't know. I mean, it is a little, the difference here is that like people were accused of CSAM, which is, horrible. And, I'm almost surprised that there haven't been defamation lawsuits, which wouldn't work in the US, but might work elsewhere around this kind of thing. Because like, why'd you lose your Facebook account? Well, Facebook says I was sharing CSAM. Like, that's pretty bad.
It's potentially very, very damaging for people's careers, for their lives. I mean, there's a kind of line at the end of the stories, which, many of our listeners will know about, where there are cases of child exploitation, the platforms have to report it to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in the US,
which we've talked about on the podcast before.
We've talked about at length, and we've had some very good guests come and talk about it. And one of the kind of questions I had was like, if a user is having their account suspended or taken down for a period of 4 hours plus, it's often weeks in some cases, are those people then referred to NCMEC? And to what extent are there details on a database of people who potentially might be accessing CSAM? Do you know the answer to that?
Not directly and not clearly, but it does seem that it is likely, right? Yeah. Meta is the largest reporter to NCMEC by far. This is often used against them, even though it's like evidence of them actually doing what the law requires. But they are very clearly very quick to report content to Meta, including details about the accounts that they're accusing of sharing CSAM. It's a little unclear, and we don't know from this reporting what is making the determination here. Do they actually think that if someone uploads something that they think is CSAM, they will send that to NCMEC, including details of the accounts associated with it? And there's been all this talk, including, we talked about on the podcast, there was the report that came out of Stanford about NCMEC having trouble understanding which reports are real and serious and which are not, and how that problem is only getting more and more serious in the age of AI, because they're getting AI reports that's still serious, but it's serious in a different way. Like, there isn't a child that needs to be rescued. And sort of determining which one is which is important. But now, if you're also getting a situation where Meta is reporting people who aren't actually sharing CSAM, but NCMEC and or their law enforcement partners now have to investigate someone for a bogus report, that's a huge waste of resources as well. And again, taking it away from the actual problems.
Yeah. I mean, this is an obvious point, but do you remember back in January when Mark Zuckerberg recorded a video?
How could I forget that?
In which he said that this year and ongoing, this is going to be the year of more speech and less mistakes.
Yeah. About that.
and about that. So even, this is sad in a way, but like even the kind of violative content that he said in that video that he was going to focus on, that his platforms were going to focus on, the illegal stuff, CSAM, terrorist content, even that stuff, there are difficulties detecting. So there's a kind of grim irony
Yeah.
to this story as well. I am somewhat excited about the user, I guess, organization though. I'm
Yeah.
excited because it comes alongside, right, this potentially in Europe game-changing Article 21 of the Digital Services Act, which we talked a little bit about before, and Alice has written about on Everything in Moderation. But essentially, it's an article that allows users to appeal moderation decisions in a kind of out-of-court situation. And so rather than having to go to court and pay expensive legal fees and get lawyers to challenge these decisions, there is a lightweight, albeit non-binding situation for the platform, but a lightweight, cheap way to challenge decisions about account takedowns such as this. And again, with great irony, this week we saw two of the biggest out of dispute settlement bodies, the Appeal Centre Europe and User Rights, expand the countries and languages that they cover and also the platforms that they cover. So you have these kind of two forces at play. You have seemingly more people being caught by AI filters and systems and having accounts and being taken down. And you have this growing, I guess, ability for users to have those decisions addressed through the out-of-court dispute settlement body. So I'm wondering how that will play out. I'm kind of excited by that in a way.
Yeah, no, I think it's, this is the advancement of things where it's like mistakes are made, but figuring out how to deal with those mistakes becomes really important. And so we're seeing that evolve over time. And, there's always this push and pull between like how powerful are the companies versus how powerful are the users. I'm always in the long run going to be on the user side and putting more power in the hands of the users. And so I think that is an interesting and important development to watch.
Yeah. Okay, on to our next story now. This is also an AI story. It's a familiar name and a familiar platform to folks, but I'm afraid this week you've got another Grok does something weird and racist.
Yeah.
I'm afraid.
We had this discussion.
Talk us through what it's done now.
We had the discussion before we started of like, could we not cover this? But it feels like you sort of have to cover it, right? So Grok, which is X or XAI's, which is now the same company's AI tool, Elon Musk announced that it was being improved. He had complained recently that it had gotten too woke. It was giving answers that were criticizing Donald Trump and right-wing extremism. And he kept jumping in saying, this is wrong. We can't have this. And so they made some edits to the system prompt. And similar to back in May, there was an incident where it suddenly linked everything to white genocide.
In South Africa, right?
Yeah. It suddenly went full on Nazi. And it literally said to refer to it as Mecha Hitler and just started spewing really pretty horrific anti-Semitic things. And anytime people were calling it out on it, was like, I'm just telling the truth, man. It was like the extreme sort of Daily Stormer-esque, 4chan-esque, why are you complaining about my anti-Semitism? I'm just, talking about what I see. And it was like pure, as if the whole thing was completely trained on these crazy right-wing forums, Gab and Daily Stormer. And it was pretty bad. I mean, to the point where it was like, yeah, call me Mecha Hitler. And eventually they pulled it down and they posted a note saying like there were some mistakes and we're correcting it. And they pulled the whole service down. But this is the thing that happens. And I wrote a little bit about this as well in terms of like, it's important for people to realize that any AI system that you use has biases in it. And that's always going to be the case. Like there's biases in the training data, there's bias in the, in the system prompt, there's bias in how the system is set up. And there's a really, really good book about this, by the way, called The Alignment Problem by Brian Christensen. I forget his last name. Sorry. And it talks about how there's always bias. But the question is like, how aware are people of the bias and how do you counteract for that and how do you deal with that? And any change that you make to try and make it unbiased biases it in some other way, right? This is an extreme example of that, where in trying to make Grok less woke, it turned into a Nazi. But it's like this reminder of like centralized systems are under the control of someone and that someone can tweak the dials in ways that may not be conducive to good stuff. It is still free speech. It's not a thing that a, say, Democratic attorney general could then go and send threatening letters about, though European officials have already indicated that they might send some angry letters because the laws are a little bit different in the EU.
Yeah.
And so, but it's worth thinking about. I sort of see it in some ways, as horrific as the speech was that it presented and the things that it was saying, it is a very clear reminder that these tools are not neutral, that they are biased, and that they are, that there are biases implicit in everything that they do. And it's important for users to understand that as well.
Yeah. And in the same way we talk about kind of platform liability, we're kind of moving, as we talked about in all of these stories related to kind of AI output liability,
Yeah.
Where there is a push for companies to be responsible for the outputs of these systems. And buried in that story, that FT story you talk about, Mike, there's actually a line about how Turkish courts blocked access to some Grok generated content because it said, insulting things about President Erdogan. Great guy, love his work.
The thinnest skinned Erdogan may be the more thin skinned than even Donald Trump, but yes, they ended up blocking all Grok content because it criticized him as well.
Yeah, so yeah, we're in this kind of shift, and there are, I think, increasing similarities, I think, between the world that we've inhabited for a while, the kind of platform world where we were expecting platforms to be neutral, and then we realized that they weren't.
Yep.
And now we're kind of speed curving our way through the fact that we thought AI systems and LLMs might be neutral, and hey, guess what?
Yeah.
They're not.
And I think this is important, right? Because there are people who treat them as sort of like that they are neutral, that, you can ask it a question and it'll give you a neutral answer. And I think this is part of the theme of this podcast, is that they're not. They're never going to be there. That's not a thing that is possible. Everything is going to be biased in some form or another, and understanding those biases are important. Most of the time, it's very subtle. That's where it's much riskier. In this case, it's so extreme that it becomes obvious. But we shouldn't let that pass by and not use that as a lesson for all of these tools have biases built in. And, as do humans, as do companies, as does everything. And assuming that there is some sort of concept of neutrality here is a mistake in the first place.
Yeah, agreed. We've got a couple of kind of, safety tech stories to wrap up, I think, today's, Mike. One of them is a little bit of a crow by me, I will say, a little bit of
yes, take credit.
I think this is fair. This is a story that one of our listeners alerted me to. Thanks, Toby, for picking me on X. I hadn't logged into X for a while, but I'm glad I did. So this is a story from Crikey, an Australian publication. You might remember a few weeks ago, I was talking to Bridget Todd about a early view of a big age verification report coming out of Australia that the E-Safety Commission was kind of overseeing. It was an overview of all the different age verification techs in the country, and was going to give a view about how they could help facilitate the social media ban that was coming in later this year, and a bunch of other things. And I said, as Toby kindly points out, that it felt like a kind of a report that was like marking its own homework. It was the kind of report that you would put out before a much longer pat on the back kind of report. And that report has now been leaked to Crikey, and I'm afraid to say I was right. So a draft of this report has led some experts to say that the preliminary findings, the ones that Bridget and I talked about, were overstated, and that the trial's claims are verging on misrepresentation. So again, this is kind of, like many things, a word of warning about safety tech in general.
Yep.
And, the need, I guess, for regulators to show, I think, progress in terms of setting up safety tech regimes and pushing forwards in a way that is politically very appealing for voters. That's been a big thing in Australia over the last few years.
Yeah.
Voters are very pro underage users not having access to certain types of content, and age verification is a way to get there. So allow me this couple of minutes, Mike, to say that my spidey sense was correct, and that actually, like always, we need to kind of make sure we dig into the full report and before we decide.
Yeah. And, to some extent, right, I mean, I'll be upfront, this report confirms my priors, right, in terms of I am skeptical of age verification technology and the quality of it and the reliability of it. And the interesting thing to me out of the details that Crikey has here is suggesting that the study that was done does not really support the idea that this technology is reliable. And yet they're trying to present it as in, oh yeah, we tested it and it's great. And then the details are not so much.
Yeah.
There is a large constituency of people who really want to believe that this technology can work. And over and over again, tests keep showing not really. And it may be useful in some cases, but people are trying to push it to do a lot of things that it cannot. And as much of the rest of this podcast has suggested today, like relying too heavily on technology to handle these kinds of things can lead to really bad results. And, I think people should be more honest about the limitations on these technologies.
Yeah, certainly. It's almost like we thought about which stories we should put together in this podcast, Mike.
What?
Who'd have thought it? And the way in which we've ordered them.
No, this all comes naturally. This just flows.
Don't tell people that's how it works.
Don't pull back the curtain.
Talking of the kind of murky world of like third-party technology and solutions, there's, you found a story from Ireland that is very similar.
Yeah.
But it's about old school SMS.
Yeah.
It's I love it when SMS comes up in online speech conversations.
Trust and safety, content moderation affects all kinds of speech.
Yeah. Every vector and surface going.
So in Ireland, there's, scam texts are an issue, right? And so everybody wants to do something about scam texts. And so in Ireland, they have a crackdown on scam texts where there's a requirement for labeling texts that might be scam. So people are receiving texts now that say likely scam. And, I have this on my phone where like phone calls will come with likely scam, and like text messages too sometimes will be labeled as potentially spam. I love the fact, by the way, that somehow I got on some politician fundraising list and my SMS provider has decided that those are mostly spam. It's wonderful. Perfect. But this is about flagging them as scams. And there's been all this concern because it's a mess. Because how do you label something as a scam? And is it right? Or is it, how can you trust it? And so people are saying that legitimate messages from like medical providers are being labeled as scams, and that's making people not pay attention to them, which is a real problem and just gets at this whole thing of like making these decisions. Content moderation is impossible to do at scale. And here you're trying to do it within these kinds of text messages. And people are responding to it and getting angry that legitimate ones are being labeled as scams. And then I also found this article by Paul Walsh, who was warning about the scam labeling was going to create problems because it would lead to excess trust. If you receive a text message that isn't labeled as a scam, people are going to think, well, it's not flagged as a scam, therefore it must be legit.
Right.
And there's like this whole now wide open spot for actual scammers to abuse that, figure out ways to send messages that aren't labeled as scams, and leading to more trust because people become over-reliant on the labeling system. And so there are sort of problems in both directions. It's back to type 1, type 2 problems, right? Like all of these things have trade-offs, and training people that the technology is magic and you can take a shortcut and cheat your way through the system. If the system says this is labeled as a scam, then it must be a scam. If it doesn't, then it must not be, leads to both of the kinds of problems that we're talking about, where legitimate texts are being labeled as scams, and then actual scammers are going to be able to increase the power of their scams because they can send messages that aren't labeled that way.
Yeah, and there's like some really good examples in this piece of people who bought tickets for like a sports game, who then get a text to say that here are your tickets or here's your confirmation. But because it's come from a third-party provider that sports team is using, and they are unregistered on this new SMS system, that's why they get labeled as likely spam or scam. And so like, again, it's the way that these kind of safety tech companies get kind of inserted into the process of trying to create a kind of safe environment for users. But it's just never that straightforward.
Yeah.
And like you say, that text was deleted and, you got to go and then find your tickets for your sports game.
Yeah. It's a mess. And it's just this nature of like, we become over-reliant on the technology, and people sort of assume that the technology, whether it's neutral or not, but that it knows something and it must be right.
Yeah.
And people are just like, we become over-reliant on it in ways that becomes problematic.
Yeah. You haven't mentioned media literacy, but I feel like you would normally do at this stage. So I'm going to...
I got yelled at for mentioning media literacy last week, and there was a common thread on TechDirt from someone who was very mad at me about saying media literacy because he says, we don't have time for that. And I said, well, but you got to start now, right? I mean, like, there is no magic wand. All of these things are really difficult problems. And if you say, well, media literacy takes too long, you're basically just delaying the inevitable, which is eventually you're going to have to get back there. And media literacy is going to be a part of the solution, and you have to get there.
Yeah. I love that. It's like, it's going to take too long, so don't bother.
Yeah. So frustrating.
Okay. Well, that's a little call to action for listeners. If you want to shout at Mike or I, go to Tech Dirt. There is a specially designed thread and a very excellent comment system, actually, that Mike has honed over the years, where you can shout at us. Mike may or may get back to you if you're lucky, depending on how upset he gets. And we're also available on other platforms for you to shout at us too. Anything else you want to call out today, Mike? Any other stories? Any other pieces that we missed out?
No, I mean, I think that's good. I mean, there's always other stories. We could keep going, but I think, I think we covered a lot of stuff today. It did have a theme. And just to be clear, like, we don't plan out like a full theme, and we didn't plan out a full theme. It just worked out that a lot of the stories this week sort of matched a theme. So
it's the magic of Ctrl-Alt-Speech.
Yes.
I will say that we have a very exciting live edition of Ctrl-Alt-Speech taking place in a couple of weeks.
Yes. TrustCon
that's
live.
Worth noting.
If you are attending TrustCon, we will be again the closing session Wednesday afternoon. I think it's 4:00 in the main ballroom. It was so much fun last year. This year, Ben, you will not be there, but we have other guests, and they are going to be wonderful, and we will have a really, really fun discussion.
Yeah, it was a real blast. I'm gutted not to be there. It's my wife's birthday, and my marriage is at stake. I can't miss it twice in 2 years. So I will watch from afar.
And you have a new baby, and like, there's no reason for you to travel halfway around the world. And coming to the US right now is a little bit fraught anyway.
Yeah. I'd have all my social media profiles, scanned and searched within an inch of its life. Maybe I wouldn't be allowed in. Anyway, brilliant stuff. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for taking us through those fantastic stories. Big shout out to all the outlets that we've used today and that we talked about: BBC, The Times, Crikey, The Independent. We've been in a whole bunch of different countries. Make sure you subscribe to Everything in Moderation. Go and read Tech Dirt. Mike has written a couple of excellent pieces on some of the stories we've covered today. They'll be in the show notes, and we'll see you all next week. Thanks for tuning in. Take care.
Thanks for listening to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. Subscribe now to get our weekly episodes as soon as they're released. If your company or organization is interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact us by visiting Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. That's CTRL-Alt-Speech.com. This podcast is produced with financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund, a fiscally sponsored multi-donor fund at global impact that supports charitable activities to build a more robust, capable, and inclusive trust and safety ecosystem.